Good morning, everyone. I am, for those who don't know, full disclosure, recovering from being sick, so I'm a little congested. I promise if I cough, I will do it directly into my elbow. But it's good to be here today for this message on the idol of whiteness, which, I was not sure what I was going to do for this. But I decided to do what I always do, which is start with a story. And this is a story about how I really started to find out that I was white. So when I was 12, my parents moved us from our extremely rural county in eastern Kentucky, in the foothills of the Appalachia, that is 97% white, in 1986 when we moved, and I checked on Wikipedia, and still today, everybody, to the inner city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And my sisters and I ended up attending essentially all black schools for the first year we lived in the city. And when I say all black, I mean like 99% African American. My sister April and I, who were in 7th grade, were the only two visibly, and I stress that, white kids in the entire school. There were quite a lot of mixed race kids, which I learned could, as my friends would sometimes describe them as that white girl over there. And I was like, oh, right, because her dad is white or her mom is white. There were a couple of Hmong kids and a couple of Latino kids, but we stood out, y'all. We were pale little white girls with thick Southern accents, and we moved to school in November. So we were also coming in mid-year. And for weeks and weeks and weeks, kids would just come up to us and be like, ain't you those white girls from the South? Talk for us. We want to hear your accent. And so we became those two white girls from the South. And I loved our school. I loved our friends. I felt like they were so smart and so like much more cooler and world weary than me and my little Southern hillbilly self. We loved our teachers, our classes. My sister and I had gotten tracked into what in MPS at the time was called the Program for the Academically Talented. That just meant we were the smart kids. So we're in these classrooms, and you're in, cohorts the way they often still do even in junior high, middle school. So we were with the same 30 kids all day long, getting to take Latin and home ec and English and social studies. Our gym teacher, y'all, was a retired Harlem Globetrotter. He was awesome. And if we were really good, he would let us on Fridays have free time in the gym, and he would play basketball with us. And it would be him against all of us. Oh, did we try to be good for him? I loved 7th grade. Who can say that? Who can say that they love 7th grade? But I did. And then partway through that year, there was parent-teacher conferences, and my folks both were working crazy hours. They didn't own a car. Getting to school was a challenge, but I begged them to please go to the parent-teacher conference. I just thought it was the coolest thing. I wanted them to see our school. They hadn't been there. And our English teacher, who was probably our collectively in my group of friends that year, we loved her. We loved her classes and what we were learning. And maybe after our Harlem Globetrotter gym teacher, she was our favorite teacher. But I overheard her when my mom showed up for that parent-teacher conference. My sister and I had to stay in the hallway so that they could talk for a little bit first. And I overheard her say to my mom, by the way, I need to name this. She, my teacher, was a white lady. And she said to my mom, was also a little Southern white lady, what are your girls doing in this school? And I was only 12, and I didn't understand that question fully, but I felt it as a betrayal in some way I couldn't articulate at 12. But what I knew absolutely was there was no way this teacher, who was our collective favorite teacher, was asking that to the moms of any of my friends. And while I had learned through my interactions with all my friends at school that I was a white girl, that was a moment I began to understand a little bit to understand what it meant for me to be white in the world. And I imagine that many of us, both watching online and in this room, have maybe had moments in our lives where we started to realize that we are actually moving through the world, especially in America, in racialized bodies that privileges whiteness over all others. So I want to invite you into a thought experiment for a moment. And I want everybody to just think for about half a minute. And so if you're in the room, if you're online, if you're watching this 20 years from now, you can still engage in this. Think for a moment when you can remember beginning to realize. So how old were you? That's a better way to ask this question. How old were you when you began to recognize that you had a race and that it mattered? Well, just think about it. Everybody just hold it. And I want you just to turn to somebody next to you. If you're comfortable, this, by the way, is by invitation only. And tell them just how old you were. You don't have to tell them the story. Just how old were you when you began to know that you had a race? And again, by invitation, for those in the room, and if you're on the chat, you feel free to put it in, and if you're online, feel free to put it in the chat. How many, and feel free to raise your hand if you want, but you can also just hold this in your heart, were like me and Kathleen, who said she was 12, in your adolescence, your childhood or adolescence. So like, you were a little kid up to your early teens that you started to know you had a race. How many of us were maybe in our 20s when we began to know that? Yeah. Folks who are older, 30s and 40s. Folks are like, I'm not raising my hand for that one. I see you. It feels almost like a little competition, right? Like, oh God, if I admit that I learned too late, did I lose? Am I a bad person? You're not a bad person. None of us are inherently good or bad. Whiteness isn't inherently good or bad. It is a construct we made up that lies to us and tells us that we are somehow inherently good or bad and that we have to be in competition. And while whiteness does that, it over and over also renders itself invisible. It's the air we're breathing and the water we're swimming in. Some of you maybe know that it's a joke and a story about two fish swimming along, and an older fish comes along and says, how's the water today? And he keeps swimming, and the younger fish are like, what the hell is water? That's how I felt as a 12-year-old standing outside that door hearing that, what are your girls doing here? Because what she meant is, what are your sweet little white girls doing at this all-black school in this poor neighborhood? And by the way, we were all poor. Every single kid, including me and my sister, in my 7th grade qualified for free lunch. Every single one of us. But whiteness set us apart and at the same time made itself invisible so that nobody was pointing it out and saying, that's the structure we are built on. And that's how white supremacy culture has worked since it got invented, because it's not some natural occurring thing. We made it up. And we made it up because whiteness is inextricably bound to capitalism and imperialism, and dare I say it, also patriarchy. And we could form a book club and read all the books written about that. And let me tell you, I've been reading all the books about that for a real long time. Dr. Ibram Kendi, who wrote the really fabulous How to Be an Anti-Racist, is also a historian, and his first major book was called Stamped from the Beginning, and I do highly actually recommend it, joking aside, that you read it, because part of what Dr. Kendi details in Stamped from the Beginning is the ways in which whiteness got invented to serve imperialism, to serve exploitative greed. That we, white people and Europeans, didn't go to Africa and start exploiting it because we thought Africans were inherently less than us. We did it because it was easy and we could make a buck. And then because we were making so much money, we said, oh shit, we need to justify this now. I had an idea, let's make up whiteness. It wasn't that straightforward, of course. But you can read the history, the literal histories of people and see the progress of turning arbitrary things like skin color into something that was a marker of worth. And that's what whiteness has done over and over. It has set up hierarchies of bodies so that it could exploit some and keep moving the marker farther and farther away for everybody, and rendering itself invisible while it does that. Oh, all right, I'll quote it. I was like, no, I'm not going to do this. Here's what whiteness is to me. White supremacy culture is like from The Usual Suspects when they're talking about Cesar Coze. And Kaiser Soze. And they say the biggest trick the devil ever did was convince people he didn't exist. And that's what whiteness does to us. It says, no, no, no. Your lived experience and your lived experience don't matter. Our histories don't matter. Over and over again. Some bodies matter, though, and some don't. And hey, if you, I'm pointing to myself here as someone with white, hillbilly, Scots, Irish, Welsh heritage, none of those categories were considered white until they came to America. Because as Dr. Cornel West has eloquently written, without black people in America, there would be no white people in America. There would only be groups with national and ethnic identities, but instead, groups of people got to come here and be told, you can have some proximity to power if you give up who you were and become white. And here's the bargain for that. Everybody else who we don't deem white doesn't get to be as good as you, but you get to be on top. Because whiteness created is what Sonia Renee Taylor, who I have mentioned in nearly every sermon I've given, I imagine I will now for the rest of my life, Sonia Renee Taylor calls white body supremacy and terrorism. She calls that the hierarchy ladder that is both outside of us and inside of every single one of us. All of us, no matter our race and ethnicity, are walking around or swimming around in white supremacy culture, and inside of us is a ladder that says some bodies matter and you better get higher up the rungs. And what we need to do as people, Sonia Renee Taylor says, is tear that ladder down. And it's a lie that there haven't been people tearing it down. It's a lie that we only have this one monolithic history moving toward some sort of progress, but only a progress for some. That our collective histories is another thing, like I said, that white supremacy and whiteness takes away from us. It whitewashes it, pun intended. So I'll ask you some more questions. It's a history quiz. You didn't know you were getting one of these, but you are. How old were you? You don't have to answer this. Just hold the question in your heart. How old were you when you learned about the Tulsa Massacre? How old were you when you learned about the Rosewood Massacre? How old were you when you learned about the Ludlow Massacre and the Wounded Knee Massacre? How old were you when you learned about the Chinese Exclusion Act and residential schools and forced sterilization? How old were you when you learned that U.S. eugenics ideas and programs were borrowed by both the Nazis and the apartheid regime in South Africa? How old were you when you learned about the Three-Fifth Compromise and the insidious loophole in the 13th Amendment that has given us today mass incarceration? How old were you when you learned that there were people at every stage in this country's history who spoke out against those things? And were you perhaps like me, this week's years old, when you learned that Frederick Douglass, who's one of my heroes and whose work I've read, and is, as one of my colleagues in seminary says, a chosen ancestor, were you this week's years old when you learned that Frederick Douglass was the most photographed person of the 19th century? He was so famous, y'all. He sold out crowds for his speaking engagements all over the US and Europe, well into the 1890s. And what if we read everything he wrote? Because as trivial as it is, although I think it's cool that he was the most photographed person of the 19th century, what if we really claimed him and his legacy? What if we memorized his speeches about the promise of America to be a truly pluralistic society? He spoke out against the Chinese Exclusion Act and was one of the few people brave enough and courageous enough to do so. In doing that, he pointed a way for us out of white supremacy. He pointed a way for us to take that ladder and knock it down. And we can claim him. We can also claim people like Unitarian and AME leader Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who I love. You should look her up. In 1866, she gave a brilliant speech that is titled, "We Are All Bound Up Together." That's what we came to call it, because in it she says, we are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity. And then she clearly named all the ways that whiteness is a curse on everyone's soul. 1866, y'all. We can claim Universalist Hosea Ballou, who in the 1830s, almost 200 years ago, decried American slavery as the ardent abolitionist that he was. And he gave a rousing speech in 1837 that debunked every argument, some arguments that are still in existence today, against the arguments against the full equality for African Americans and of Native peoples. He tore them down, said this is all BS, and let me point by point counter every argument somebody could have. 200 years ago, Hosea Ballou was showing us the way out of whiteness and how to lay down that ladder of hierarchy. There have been people all along our history showing us a different path. And whiteness keeps trying to wash it away. And I'll be honest with you, that makes me despair sometimes. And I despair not just for the atrocities of our history, but for the ways in which all the brave and clear-headed and warm-hearted people in our history have been taking a stance against oppression, and that it feels like we're still doing their work. Is it ever going to be done? And I stand before you as a ministerial intern pursuing a path to Unitarian Universalism ministry, and I don't know what form it's going to take, but I'm not going to lie, there's a whole lot of days where I'm like, what am I doing? What are any of us doing? Because it feels like change is impossible sometimes. And how can I, as a middle-aged white lady, have any kind of audacity to say that change is possible? And the more I look at history and the more I look at our own Unitarian Universalist history, what is revealed to me is that we have failed in our promise and our potential over and over and over again. We fail people. We, as a denomination today is the two denominations we grew out of shut African Americans and women and people of color out of leadership over and over again to the detriment of everyone. And we have to reckon with that. And it's hard and it's shameful. And one of the lies that whiteness whispers to us over and over and over again is that we can't do it. That the problem is too big. That if we can't solve everything, if we can't go big, then just go home. And that is a lie. And it's not just a lie, because if you are moving through this world in anything like brown skin, you don't get to shut your eyes and pretend whiteness doesn't matter. But if you are moving through white skin like me, your soul is also hurt by that, just like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper said 150 years ago. We are all damaged spiritually. And yeah, some of us are damaged physically. And we lose our lives to the lies whiteness tells us. So even though I despair, I know I have to keep trying. And I know I'm going to keep failing. And I know I'm going to keep failing because I've already failed a lot. Because part of why I despair is that even though I was a 12-year-old kid standing outside a door, hearing some really hard truths about the world, by the time I was in 12th grade, and at a pretty racially integrated high school just a few years later, I didn't even notice that in my AP English class, in a high school of 1,800 kids from all different backgrounds, there were only 14 of us in that class, and every single one of us was white. And if someone had asked me, I might have said that all the smart black kids, like the ones I was in 7th grade with, were at the college prep high schools across town. And a lot of them were. But I look back and I know there were smart black kids and brown kids at my high school who could have been in my AP English class, and nobody pointed out that they weren't. And I, who had been a 12-year-old outside that door learning about whiteness, had to get to college and start learning about whiteness again. And I have to keep learning it over and over. I despair because that ladder of hierarchies that Sonia Renee Taylor named doesn't come down once. I have to get up every day, and start tearing it down again, because whiteness is always at work rebuilding itself, hiding itself, making the structures we stand on invisible. And yes, it can feel like a never-ending task, but the fact is, it is. It is a never, are we still breathing? Then we still have work to do. And I'm not talking about doing work incrementally, right? You know, Dr. Martin Luther King, in his letter to Birmingham Jail, already talked about white moderates and our move towards incrementalism. But we also can't do everything at once. And so it's not a choice between, oh no, we'll never get the work done. Oh no, we can't do anything. It's just a choice to show up and do what we can do now. That's what Adrienne Marie Brown and organizers like her talk about when they talk about an emergent strategy, that we have to be iterative and fractal in our work. And what that means is we have to be in relationship with people who will hold us accountable to keep seeing the systems, to keep recognizing the systems, and to keep doing what actions are in our hands to do to dismantle them. I'll tell you one more failure of mine as an example of this. About 4 years ago, in the before times, I went out to dinner with my husband and two of our friends, two of our best friends I've known since college, two other middle-aged, cute, healthy white women, for a birthday. And some of you have seen pictures of my husband, and you know that he is a very tall, 6'2", 200+ pound dude with long flowing hair now. But he's of Korean and African American descent. And my husband is one of those people that all his life, like so many brown people in America, has been asked over and over again, what are you? And where are you from? No, where are you really from? And I've heard people ask him that In the 25 years that we have been friends, I've heard it over and over. So we were at this restaurant, and it was a really nice restaurant, and we had a lovely meal. And when we got up, the four of us, to walk away, every head, and I mean every head that could see us, turned and watched us all walk out. And as we got to the door and away from where other people could hear us, my husband said, "Wow, all those white people," and it was all white people, "really had to get a look at the brown guy, didn't they?" And I said, without even thinking, "Oh, they were just impressed that you were with three such cute women." And we all laughed, said goodbye in the parking lot, and got in the car. And before he turned the key on, my husband turned to me and said, "I need you to know, that really hurt my feelings. That really hurt my feelings, that you could witness that and turn it into a joke." Y'all, I was so ashamed. Because I had seen over and over people other him and stare at him and ask him in little implicit and explicit ways, "Do you belong?" And I had made a joke of it. We'd been together almost 20 years by that point, and I made a joke of it. And I just had to look at him and breathe and quell every impulse in me to defend myself or to talk about my intentions. And I just had to sit there and breathe and say, "I am so sorry. I'll do better next time." And that is what we are all always being asked to do better next time in relationship. And we come together as a faith community to do this because it is only in relationship with other people that we actually can affect any real change. It's not about being some individual savior or the most woke person in the room. It is about being in relationship where I can sit and be uncomfortable and trust that you will tell me your truth, and I can accept it and learn from it and then offer you mine. It is in relationship, faithful, accountable relationship, that we tear that ladder down. We're trying to do it as a faith movement. We are trying in Unitarian Universalism to live up to the best of our ideals despite all of our failures. It is why congregations across this country are studying and affirming the eighth principle, to say that in faith communities, as spiritual work, we will hold ourselves accountable to dismantle racism and other oppressions as they show up here in us. We cannot pretend it is a problem out there. It is a problem here. And we are the ones that need to sit and look our beloveds in the face. And our beloveds are everyone, are they not? And say, "I am sorry, and I will do better next time." Adrienne Rich once wrote, "My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed that I have to cast my lot with those who age after age perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world." That is our work together. Dismantling oppression, tearing down every day that idol of whiteness, is together how we heal each other and how we do indeed remake the world. May we have the courage to do it. Friends, will you pray with me? Spirit of life and love, I'm humbled to be here, finding my way forward, how to serve this community. And I ask that each of us be given the grace and the love to show up for each other in all the ways that our gifts call us, in all the ways that we are needed to make the world whole. We are all a hurt and hurting people. And in the words of Rumi, we have indeed broken our promises 100,000 times, and yet we still come. We come because ours is not a caravan of despair, but one of hope. So hold us this morning in hope and guide us in love. May it be so, and amen.